HR Basics is a series of short courses designed to highlight what you need to know about a particular human resource management topic. In today's HR Basics, we explore the 3 simple rules of discipline documentation and how to apply them in practice. Documentation is one of the most effective tools for managing employee performance and behavioral issues and reducing legal risks. In fact, one of the best ways to deal with employee performance and behavior problems is documentation. Documentation can improve performance, reduce the risk of employee lawsuits, and provide powerful evidence to help an employer defend against future claims. Documentation shapes expectations where coaching alone can be ineffective. Documentation shows an employee their chance to improve, creating a fair work environment. And if the employee doesn't take that opportunity, documentation is proof that the employer tried to provide the tools and resources for the employee to succeed, and it's evidence that a termination decision was not arbitrary. Despite these impressive benefits, employers frequently neglect documentation. Sometimes this happens because they do not understand or appreciate the importance of documentation. Sometimes the employer thinks documentation is too complicated, and sometimes the employer considers documentation too time-consuming. Let's explore 3 critical rules of disciplinary documentation. Documentation can be simple and quick if employers and managers follow these 3 rules of disciplinary documentation. They're pretty easy. First, just do it. Second, know your audience. And third, tell the story. Rule number 1, just do it. The biggest problem for many employers is that they simply do not document. So our first rule is our simplest. Employers need to document. There are 5 critical reasons that employers need to document. First, documentation provides an opportunity for the employee to improve. Documentation shapes employee expectations, decreases litigation, juries expect documentation, and documentation establishes legitimate business reasons for taking action. Documentation provides an opportunity for any employee to improve. At the core of performance management is communication of employers' expectations. Let's face it, it's hard to deliver bad news to an employee, and subsequently, people managers nearly universally water down the message in delivery. And the employee listening will filter the message missing parts and will mishear others. Neither the employee or the manager will then remember the message over time. Documentation overcomes these challenges through a carefully crafted written message. The employee can read and is less likely to misunderstand and more able to recall the message. Through documentation, the employee has the best opportunity to improve. In the end, the goal is to help employees succeed. The better the communication, the better the chances of improved performance and corrected behavior. Documentation shapes employees' expectations. An employee who has not been warned in writing is more likely to be surprised when terminated, and a surprised employee is more likely to sue. Why? It's all because of expectations. Most employees assume that they're doing well. If an employer terminates an employee who's never been warned of performance problems or behavioral issues, or is only warned verbally, that employee is more likely to be surprised and feel angry and mistreated. Documentation decreases litigation for at least 2 reasons. First, documentation shapes employee expectations and subsequently reduces the surprise, anger, and perception of unfairness of terminations. Second, if the employee considers suing, documentation provides evidence that makes the employee's case weaker and therefore less attractive to a plaintiff's lawyer. The documentation may persuade a plaintiff's lawyer that the termination was for legitimate business reasons and may decide not to pursue the case. Even if the lawyer takes the case, the documentation may affect the lawyer's valuation of the case, meaning that the lawyer may be less aggressive or settle more readily. Juries expect documentation. Employers often fear that juries may be more likely to sympathize with the employee. This fear can be well-founded, especially if the employer has failed to document. 61% of jurors say that employers need to be sent a message. 74% of jurors think that an employee should be provided fair warning before termination, and 90% of jurors said that the employer is negligent if it does not properly document performance problems. Thus, an employer that has to explain its actions to a jury will have an uphill battle if they fail to document and warn the employee. Documentation establishes legitimate business reasons for action. Virtually every wrongful termination lawsuit boils down to the employee claiming that they were fired for some illegal reason. There is nothing mysterious about wrongful termination lawsuits. The employee will claim the termination was for some illegal reason, such as discrimination or whistleblowing, and the employer will claim that the employee was instead fired for lawful reasons, such as bad behavior, poor performance, or a reduction in force. The employer needs evidence to support their position. Documentation that defines the problem and the associated impacts on the organization establishes legitimate business reasons for the employment action. Now for rule number 2, know your audience. Disciplinary documentation has two audiences. Most employers focus on and write for only one audience, the employee. While the employee is the primary audience, employers often fail to recognize that they're writing for a large and equally important secondary audience: agencies, lawyers, judges, and juries. Most employers focus on and write only for one audience, the employee. While the employee is the primary audience, employers fail to recognize that they're writing for an equally important secondary audience that includes agencies, lawyers, judges, and juries. Because the secondary audience plays such an important role, the employer should write employee documentation for the secondary audience, not just for the employee. Writing for the secondary audience is different from writing to the employee because the secondary audience is not familiar with the situation or the employer's business. The employer's documentation must overcome this unfamiliarity in order to persuade the secondary audience by first explaining the problem and the impact. Although the employee may be familiar with what happened, the secondary audience is not. The documentation should factually describe what happened, the problem, and why it matters to the organization, the impact. Second, avoid jargon. Again, the employer may understand internal jargon, but the secondary audience will not. Jargon will make a documentation more difficult for a secondary audience to understand and therefore less persuasive. Finally, rule number 3, tell the story. The most important rule of documentation is telling the story, factually describing what happened and why it matters. Tell your story in documentation by following these guidelines. Find the facts, paint a word picture, and don't forget the punchline. First, find the facts. Storytelling requires the employer to learn the facts. Workplace investigations reduce the chance of acting on incorrect or incomplete information. While people often think of investigations as large, disruptive, and costly, many investigations consist simply of interviewing witnesses with first-hand knowledge of what happened. Basic workplace investigations require the employer to talk with key witnesses to learn the facts and give the accused an opportunity to tell their side of the story. Second, paint a word picture. To effectively document workplace issues, tell a story that paints a picture with words. Painting a word picture involves factually describing the events so the secondary audience can picture what happened and form their own opinions and conclusions about the employee's behavior. Since at least 70% of the brain is devoted to interpreting and understanding visual images, it's worth tapping into that part of the mind when you can. People are persuaded by visual images, and accordingly, employers should paint a word picture to persuade the primary and secondary audience. When painting your word picture, avoid using labels, adjectives, and conclusions. Instead, the employer should describe the facts so that the reader can visualize what happened and draw his or her own conclusions. To paint a word picture, tell what happened, describe the employer's fairness, and describe the employee's response. Finally, number 3, don't forget the punchline. Documentation should conclude with a punchline, an explanation of the positional consequences if problems continue. At the same time, the employer should preserve flexibility to allow options as to the next step. The punchline alerts employees to the seriousness of the problem while protecting the employer's flexibility to respond to further issues. In any situation of employee performance or discipline, we must be poised to think about, write well, and then give a well-crafted document to the employee.